Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Institute for Advanced Study of the University of Strasbourg. And I'd like to especially welcome Professor Riccardo Manzotti, who will give the public lecture of today. I will ask now Gregorio Kars, who's a philosopher teaching at Syracuse University and at Sciences Po, to give a short introduction of the speaker.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks to the Institute of Advanced Studies for making this possible. A pretty good crowd, which is interesting. You do know that it's booked to be a talk about consciousness, right? I mean, when this sort of stuff gets a hold of the public imagination, we are living in interesting times, I think, okay? Okay, so we have people here from neuroscience, and cognitive science, psychology, but also physics, chemistry, biology. Some of you use computer code to simulate virtual reality. Some of you want to be one with the absolute. Some of you work in the labs with animals, and some of you work in the lab with robots. There are the religious, the skeptical, those people who do yoga, and some philosophers eventually. They tend to arrive late, they sit in the back, and you just know they can't wait to get at the drinks and the food, right? Okay, so to introduce a talk on this thing called consciousness is a bit of a challenge because everybody here from that entire wide spectrum figures they're some sort of expert in consciousness already, just by being conscious. Somehow, being conscious is knowing consciousness. The being is the knowing, and some would say even knowing it completely. And yet, the wonder remains. The big philosophical questions about consciousness remain. How does a body relate to a mind? How does appearance relate to reality? How does a person relate to a world? We don't have any clue. The philosophical and scientific fact of the matter here is we have no idea. And it gets worse. We don't even know where conscious experience actually takes place. And that's a lot not to know. Well, enter Riccardo Manzotti. When I first thought about how to introduce his ideas, I wanted to focus on that story of the older, wiser fish who confuses the younger fish by swimming past and casually greeting them by saying, "How's the water, boys?" And the younger fish sort of float for a while going, "What the hell is water?" Anyway, in a certain way, our speaker's ideas seem like rare rising bubbles that float past and maybe or maybe not catch our attention. Anyway, it would have been sort of fun to suggest that he's older and wiser while you are all young, confused fish swimming in your ignorance. Anyway, instead of doing that, I think I'll just mention two things that will be helpful to bear in mind while you listen to him explain his ideas. The first is the strong intuitive pull that we're all under. If asked where one's conscious mind is, if one is asked where they are essentially, most people will point at their heads. But it's an accident of evolution that so many sense doors happen to be around here near your head. Imagine if it were otherwise. Imagine if your knees were the place where you heard things from, for instance. Imagine that intuitive pull. It's hard to do. Imagine making those telephone calls. Okay, some of you actually imagine making those calls, and that's good. Keep going, all right? Anyway, even with the sense doors being where they are, humans haven't always felt that they were behind their eyes and between their ears. History and literature indicate the breath, for example, or the belly, or the sex organs, or the heart as the seat of the soul. When the ancient Egyptians made their mummies, only the heart was allowed to remain in the mummified body, in the center of the body. All the other organs were carefully taken out and preserved elsewhere, except for the brain, by the way. That bit they just worked into a pulp with a hook that they jammed up the nose, and then they just got rid of the oozing, mucky, smelly residue afterwards. So that might be some sort of weird message to later day neuroscientists. I don't know. Anyway, but so what is it like? What is it like to have a change in the location of your mind? Now, if a man is staring at a woman's body while they're carrying on a conversation, he will annoy her. And chances are she will gesture with her face, hello, stop staring, I'm up here, right? But we can imagine in ancient times, the woman wagging her body, hello, stop peering into my eyes, I'm down here, right? Something like that. And it's really strange to try to imagine this. It's hard to do. Anyway, I think it's a good idea to bear in mind that Riccardo Manzotti's theory of consciousness is a mind relocator. He's going to call on you to challenge the strength of the pull of your intuitions. And one last thing to bear in mind is category mistakes. So my favorite example here is at the supermarket checkout line. Try to buy that little metal bar that they use to separate your groceries from the next customer's groceries, right? But I need one of these, you plead with the cashier. You don't know what it's like where I live. But that thing is never going to be for sale. You've made a category mistake. Now look, Riccardo Manzotti is making no such category mistake. He is not calling something consciousness that simply and decidedly cannot be consciousness, although you might think so. But that's on you. He is calling on you to examine that decision. How is it you've decided to limit what consciousness can be in principle? In any case, again, it's well to realize that we have deep habits of thought, and they might get in the way of following his argument, of seeing what he means, of really getting it. But anyway, it's a good idea to go ahead and break habits. Get in the habit of breaking habits, but don't break all of them. That would just be another habit. Okay. Anyway, I think we're ready now. Riccardo Manzotti is a philosopher of mind. He's a perceptual psychologist. He's a robotics engineer, and he's a comic book artist. And he's come here to spread your mind, ladies and gentlemen. Riccardo Manzotti.
Today, I like very much the suggestion that I'm here to pull your intuition about our experience, about what we are. All such intuitions are about a fundamental problem. What are we? What am I in the world? What am I in the physical world? And what is my experience in the physical world? And is there anything that I can place my finger and say, that is my experience? Just to give you an idea of the way in which the problem is usually framed by the scientific community, we can have a look at this diagram from Christoph Koch, in which we have the external world, external to the body, the activity in the brain, and then we have the last step. The last step is how can neural activity somehow produce our experience of the world. This is the way in which usually the problem is framed. And as you can see, everything is more or less clear, although very difficult, very complex, until we get to the last step. So, we know everything about external objects, we know a lot about the light, we know a lot about how eyes work, we know a lot about neural activity, we are getting to know more and more about all the details of neural activity, but then we are left in the dark as to the very last step. How is it possible and why our neural activity should become anything like our experience of the world, which is much closer, if you look carefully at this way to present the problem, at the starting point of the chain. The dog that we see, the dog that we find in our experience, is much closer to the dog that walks than to the neural activity taking place in our brain. This is the hard problem of conscious experience. And this idea, although very popular, has also been heavily criticized by many authors. And for example, a psychologist like Skinner claimed that this idea of consciousness is very much like a digestive notion of experience. So basically, we swallow information, bits of information, and then through some unknown and mysterious digestive process in the brain, this is of course an allegory, somehow the brain produces subjective experience. And now we have for the first time the apple that I gave to you. So we are left with a puzzle. Neuroscience has tried for decades to find conscious experience in the brain. And it's very fashionable when you have to talk about consciousness to put a brain next to you somewhere. So we see that what they do, they show a brain, and that seems to be a very scientific thing to do. The fact is that if we look at what neuroscience has found in the last 100 years, peering deeper and deeper inside the brain, we could say that there has been just one uncontroversial result, experimental result. In the brain, there is nothing like our experience. People have been peering in the brain, they have been looking for neural spikes, they have been looking for neural activity, they have been looking for all kinds of neural underpinnings going on. But so far, the more we know about what's going on in the brain, and the less we are able to explain the last step. We haven't found anything that seems like our conscious experience. But we keep looking inside the brain, and that it is curious. And I would say it is even a little bit not scientific. Why? Because in science, people should make a prediction, and then they should check the prediction. They should make an hypothesis, and then they should look for conditions that verify their hypothesis. But in the case of consciousness, nothing that has been found or nothing that has not been found in the brain has challenged the starting hypothesis of neuroscience, namely that consciousness has to be in the brain. So they have not found anything remotely like consciousness, anything like our experience. And what was the conclusion? That phenomenal experience has to be in the brain, but has to be invisible, has to be something that cannot be observed like everything else. If I were looking for the Higgs boson and I didn't find anything, I would draw the conclusion that maybe the Higgs boson is not there. But in the case of consciousness, neuroscience has followed a strangely different path. They haven't found anything, and the conclusion was not that it was not there. The conclusion was that it must be there, but it must be such that it is invisible. And that's a strange conclusion inside, to conclude that if I don't find something, it has not to be, it must be some unobservable. And so in the end, we are having just a kind of Platonic notion that the brain is some kind of portable Platonic cave in which the world is projected on some kind of mental screen. After all, if we've seen in the recent cartoon Inside Out, we've seen that what do we have inside the brain of Riley? We have a screen. Unfortunately, neuroscientists so far has not found any mental screen, any neural screen on which our experience is gonna be projected or is going to take place. Actually, in the 50s, philosophers and neuroscientists advanced the mind-brain identity theory. So they claim, we don't know yet, but maybe our conscious experience must be just a brain process. And that was a very good empirical and scientific hypothesis, something that had to be verified. But in principle, it was a good hypothesis. I think that after 70 years, we can have some idea about what was the experimental outcome of this hypothesis. It was not verified. We haven't found anything like our conscious experience in the brain. But I think the hypothesis was good. So today, I will put forward a radical hypothesis about the nature of consciousness. I will suggest a different physical process for our conscious experience. I will suggest that our conscious experience is physical, but it is not in the brain. Let's grab the apple. So I ask you to grab the apple if you haven't eaten yet. You can eat it afterward. This hypothesis that, as we will see, is very similar to the mind-brain identity hypothesis, is a kind of mind-object identity hypothesis. And I will briefly explain what I mean. You're all conscious subject. You're all looking at an apple in your hands. You all have an object, a physical object in front of you. And you are having an experience of such an object. Now, right now, each of you has a brain, a body, and an apple. There are three physical entities. Now, think about your experience that you're having now. So stop looking at me, look at the apple. If you look at the apple, and then I asked you to describe your experience of the apple, what are you going to find inside your experience? Describe your experience, well, to yourself, but... And I would say that you would describe your experience as being red, round, shiny, appleish. Now, of these three objects, the brain, the body, and the apple, which one is the closest to your own experience of the apple? Which one has all the properties that right now you're finding in your own conscious experience of the apple? And I would say that the brain doesn't score so well. The brain is gray, mushy, with all blood vessels, all kind of stuff, pitch dark in the dark. The body is not like an apple, but the apple is just like our experience of the apple. And it's here. And it's just in front of us. So if we compare brain activity with the apple, it's a non-starter. The apple wins on all scores. So I know that at the beginning it sounds very strange, this hypothesis, because it goes against the premise, the assumption that we must be inside our body. But is that necessary to be inside our body? Or maybe our body has a role in carving out the part of the external, the surrounding physical reality that is one and the same with our experience. And so the hypothesis that I make is that the thing that we call conscious experience is nothing but the external object. So just to make in comparison the traditional hypothesis that experience has to be in the brain, the mind-body identity. That's the traditional hypothesis. A hypothesis that has been tested again and again by the neuroscience community, with no hope of finding anything with the properties of our conscious experience, and producing, therefore, the test for the neural correlates of consciousness is a failure, because we don't look for the thermical correlate of temperature, or for the correlate of, say, dark matter. We look for dark matter, we look for actual phenomena. Only in the case of consciousness, we've been looking for correlates. And the reason is that neuroscientists knows very well that inside the brain there is nothing like our experience. I just point the hypothesis that I presented here, and namely that the thing that is our experience of the apple is just the apple. And the reason are that there's nothing in the physical world that it is closer to my experience of the apple. So if we apply a criterion based on having the same properties, well, the apple has just the properties of my own experience. In philosophy, we have the problem to explain the relation between our brain and the external world, between our brain and the meaning, between our neural states and what they are about. If the thing that I am is the external object, we have also set the problem of intentionality and aboutness aside, because there's no longer need for the mind to be about the world, because the mind would be identical with the world. So basically here I am making this radical hypothesis that the mind is just the external world, made of apples, made of rooms, walls, faces, other people's body, everything that we find in our experience round the clock. So if I ask you, what do you find in your own experience since you wake up until when you go to sleep? Well, I would say that I find objects, cars, buildings, trees. So why couldn't be this stuff, the very physical stuff my experience is made of? Usually we rule this possibility out because we say, well, this stuff is outside our body. But why should that be a problem? We don't know where is the thing that we are. And we often say in our language, we have a body. We don't say, I am a body. We say we have a body. And this insight has led many people in the past to suppose that we had to be a soul, an immaterial mind. My hypothesis places ourselves in the physical world, only not in the body. So the idea is that the body, in this view, is not the place, is not the place where consciousness is hidden, but it is the physical condition that allow the world I am identical with, or that I suppose I am identical with, to be in the way it is. Now, I suspect that many of you may have several objections. And I had several objections for years. And in order to provide you with some element to address some of your worries, I need to make two further steps. Those two steps address two different objections. The first objection is what I call the objection of subjective variability. You could say to me, Riccardo, this idea might work if you were the only subject in the world. But what about the fact that we all see a different apple? That a dichromat may not see the color of the apple. That we see the apple that you hold in your hands as much smaller than what you are seeing right now. We may see things, I may touch the apple, I may feel the apple warm because I've been outside. You may say to me, Riccardo, people have introduced the notion of subjective experience because people have subjective experiences. If we all had exactly the same experience, if we all perceive the same world, you may be right. But it's obvious that we all perceive a different world. And so in order to explain the fact that we perceive a different world, we have to introduce subjective experience that might be different for each of us. So this is the objection of subjective variability. The second objection that is the objection of misperception. Dreams, hallucination, illusions, all cases in which we see apples that don't seem to be there. So in all such cases, you may say, Riccardo, when you dream of an apple, there's not an apple. So you cannot be the apple because there's no apple there. So all those cases are as many counterexamples to your hypothesis. In order to address the problem of subjective experience, I would like to start again with the apple and ask you, is the apple that I gave you right now, that it is sitting, stays put on the desk in front of you, still, or is it moving? It looks still, but you all know that right now that apple is moving relative to the moon. And it is also moving in a different way relative to the sun. So the apples that right now you have in front of you are actually moving. and not just in one direction. As strange as it seems, they are moving in every direction. Only in our experience, we have only one of those velocities. We don't have all of them. Why? Because we can perceive only the velocity that the apple has relative, not to us, relative to our body. So even if the apple is moving relative to the sun, we are oblivious to such velocity, because the only velocity that we can actually experience is the velocity it has relative to our body. This is all well known. This is nothing new. I mean, it's 4 centuries that Galileo made a statement about the relative nature of velocity. If that is true, it is also interesting, because it means that this apple doesn't have one velocity, but it has many. So a property like velocity, which is a perfectly respectable physical velocity, is actually more complex than it seems. Let's consider another property, color. Now, if I ask you, is that square white or not? You probably would say, yes, that square is white or whitish. But if you had super sight, if you were able to see the pixels, the little lights that the square is made of, you would be able to see the Bayer grid, the red, green, blue Bayer grid, which is used by computers in order to make white. And therefore, if you had that visual system, Superman visual system, you would see a colored grid. If you were dichromat, you would see another colored grid, and so forth. My point is that square white or colored? And I would say it is white relative to a standard human trichromat at more than 1 meter of distance. It is a colored Bayer grid relative to, for example, a human being with a lens very close to the square. And there's no reason to say that it is more white than colored or more colored than white. Likewise, I think it is possible to make the same argument for all other properties of the apple. So my point is that all the properties that we assume to be there, independent of our body, in an absolute way in the external object, are there only because they can take place relative to the physical structure in our body. According to this view, what we see is not a subjective color, it is the way in which the color of the apple takes place relative to my visual system. Exactly in the same way in which if I bump against a car that is moving at 50 kilometers an hour towards me, and I'm moving at 50 kilometers an hour in the same direction, the speed at which we crash against each other is a relative velocity of 100 kilometers per hour. And there's nothing subjective in the heat that I get from such a crash. But it is relative. Not relative to a subject, though, relative to an object. So the idea is that the very simple notion of relative existence expressed by Galileo with velocity can be extended to all properties and can be used in order to explain the subjective variability of the external world. The idea is that what we've been calling subjective experience was only the way in which the world takes place relative to our bodies. And since our bodies are all different from each other to some extent, we all interact with a world that it is slightly different, but not with a subjective internal world, but an external world that it is different because our body allows such a world to take place in a different way. The idea is to reduce subjectivity, which is being relative to a subject, which is a very troublesome notion because the subject is by definition outside of the physical world, it's not an object, therefore it will compel us to step outside of the physical world. The idea is that we can reduce such subjectivity to a kind of object relativity. just as in relative velocity. I like to use the expression that such properties take place, because from a scientific perspective, we don't need such properties to be there all the time. Relative velocity doesn't need to be there all the time. I need relative velocity only when I bump against something, only when I provide the causal condition for that property to be causally efficacious, to produce effects. And so properties in this view are all actual properties. By actual properties, I mean that they have a possibility to take place because of a causal interaction. So in a way, they're a little bit like the fridge light. When I need them, they are there. And because my body is like the act of opening the fridge door, I have the impression that the world is made of properties that are always there, only because my body is always here. Therefore, those colors I'm familiar with take place whenever my eyes are in front of the object. Those sounds, those shapes, those lengths, all properties I am familiar with, they take place because my body allows them to take place. Here we have to face a bigger problem that I won't have to deal with here, but a problem that started in the history of philosophy with Plato in the Sophist, when a mysterious character, the stranger, so Plato calls him, he has no other name, he's just the stranger, will make exactly this claim, that to be real is to take place. To be real is to be causally efficacious. And this notion that has been expressed in the Sophist has been challenged by Plato. Plato didn't like that notion because Plato liked the idea that existence is independent of being actually engaged in some kind of causal interaction. But this idea is still, I think, very much alive, for example, in science. I think that in science we can agree that we cannot talk about something that it is causally aloof, that it is causally unable to produce any effects. If something is real, something has to be able to make a causal difference. What is the role of the body and the brain? Do I say that the body doesn't have any role, that the brain is not important? Not at all. What I claim is that the body and the brain is like a dam, and like a dam is the necessary condition for the existence of a lake. Like we need a frame of reference in order to have velocity, we need to have, for example, a visual system in order for the property that we call color to take place. So the idea is that the brain is necessary, and the brain is also very important in setting the condition that allow the lake, that here represents the external object, to take place in a certain way. But the lake is not inside the dam. It's not literally inside the bricks of the dam. Imagine that people didn't know anything about lakes and dam, and that people have been trying to explain lakes just as a byproduct of dams. Imagine that people have tried to understand how it is possible for the bricks in the dam, for the concrete in the dam to produce water. Because if they didn't know anything about that, they could see whenever we build a dam, then after a while we get a lake. Then they could say, well, maybe the dam, the bricks, the concrete are able to produce a lake. And they've been looking inside of the brain to look for consciousness, like people looking inside the bricks and the concrete of the dam to look for water. But so far they haven't found anything. So what I'm saying is not that consciousness is not the outcome of the existence of brains, but that brains don't produce consciousness literally. They set the condition for the thing that it is one and the same with our experience to take place. After all, if we built a dam, let's say in the desert, we could build a 1 mile high dam, there would be no lake. Likewise, we don't know if we were able to let a brain to grow like an organoid with no connection with the external world, but anatomically running, we don't know whether the brain would have any consciousness, any experience. It might be just a brain. So in a way, my hypothesis is very simple. it is. The brain is just a brain. The apple is just an apple. And in order to explain our experience of the apple, we have just to understand what is our experience. So it's not a big mystery. We don't have to find a genie that is making a miracle inside of the brain to produce something that nobody has ever seen inside the brain. Something like our experience of the brain. Maybe the hard problem was so hard only because people kept looking in the wrong place. So once you start from the wrong hypothesis, there's no way you can get a solution. Maybe the solution was just to watch somewhere else. There is a joke about a drunk man going back home and looking for the keys. He's not able to find the keys, so he's looking for the keys under the light cast by a lamppost. Then a friend comes in and asks, "Why are you looking for the key there under the light of the lamppost? Did you lose your keys there?" And the drunk replies, "No, I didn't lose them there, but that's the only place where I can see." And likewise, it seems to me that neuroscience has been looking in the place where they have a lot of light, where they have brain imaging, fMRI, all kind of tools, all kind of details. So the idea is that the world that surrounds us is just a kind of projection, causal projection of the structure of our body. Strangely enough, when two people look at each other, one is the body of the other. So it's not that they are the same person, but when I look at you, I am your body. And when you look at me, you are my body. The thing that you find in your experience right now is my face. You may just consider whether it is more reasonable to assume that the thing that is in your experience right now is an image of my face, if no one has ever been able to find a thing such as an image of the external world. So the idea is that we are not our body, but we are the external apple, but the relative apple. So the apple that takes place in a way that is unique to our body. If you ate your apple, the apple would take place in a different way. It would produce different causal effects. If you touched your apple, the apple would take place in a different way, because the causal processes between the external object and your body would be completely different. And between the tactile apple and the visual apple, there isn't almost any similarity. They take place in a very different way. So the idea is to consider this apparently preposterous hypothesis, namely that we are really one and the same with the surrounding world, and that our body is not the place where we are, but it is the condition at the end of the causal chain that allow us to exist. And now we are getting to the last point. What about all those cases in which there seems to be no apple? You close your eyes and I ask you, how was the apple in front of you? What was its color? Was it yellow? Was it red? Was it shiny? Was it completely uniform or not? And with your eyes closed, you're kind of concocting a mental image of the apple. Or maybe tonight you can go to bed and you can dream of this apple. Or you may have a hallucination. Aren't all these cases counterexamples to an extremely strong realist and physicalist hypothesis about the nature of the apple? Yes and no. I ask you once again to reconsider what we know about basic physics of perception. A subtitle of my presentation might have been Back to Physics. In fact, if you pay attention to what I've been talking about today, I've been talking more about the physical structure of the external world than about the phenomenological aspects of our perception. That's because I'm trying to provide you with a physical account of experience. In order to explain hallucination and dreams, I ask you to reconsider is the fact that time is never instantaneous. All time span of every physical phenomenon is always not finite. is always extended, because we know by Einstein's relativity and by basic physics that everything takes time to exist. In fact, neural activity too takes time. We know that in order to have the perception of something, we need something like between 25 up to 300 milliseconds. But first, let me tell you something about hallucination and dreams and delusions and all kinds of misperception, because I need to have to clarify a possible misunderstanding. Often people believe that we can hallucinate everything we like, or that hallucination or dreams are completely free of any boundaries because they take place in a mental world. That's not the empirical evidence. Actually, it is a myth that we can hallucinate or have a dream about everything. That's not the case. We know that, for example, all cases of purely endogenous generated mental activity have been greatly overestimated, if not mistakenly presented. A certain period, there was the idea that if you are a synesthete, then you may see a color even if you are a congenitally blind subject. And even important neuroscientists like Ramachandran or like other authors, they claim that there have been patients like that. I went through all the literature to find the patient, the congenitally blind born chromatic synesthete, able to see colors just by listening to numbers. This patient never exists. They assume that that might have been the case. They assume that it makes sense to have someone able to see colors because it has synesthesia from numbers to colors, even if he was or she was congenitally blind. But that patient never existed. Likewise, whenever you go through the literature and, for example, you check cases in which people get direct electrical stimulation in their brain, if they had been congenitally blind, they don't report any color experience. They report color experience only if they were not congenitally blind. Occasionally, if you look at the patient, they got blind, say, at 3 years of age, 4 years of age, 6 years of age, or if they were not total, they were congenitally blind, but not totally congenitally blind. So if you look through the literature, it seems that in order to have an experience of something, you need to have had a physical encounter with that something. And likewise, if you, for example, here I quote Penfield because it's just the first that made this kind of experiment. If you stimulate the brain, people report just pieces and of their previous life. They report they have been the familiar faces, familiar places, and everyday situation and condition. The same is true in most of the actual syndromes of hallucination. People hallucinate pieces of their previous life. They don't create novel properties. The properties their dreams and hallucination are made of are just the properties and their lives have been made of up to that point. And if you think about your own dreams, I think you will find a personal confirmation of this claim that I am making. What are your dreams made of? They're made of colors, sounds, buildings, people with faces. Have you ever dreamt a color that you haven't seen in your own life? Can you really claim that one day you woke up and you told to someone, oh, you know what, last night I dreamt a color that I've never seen in the rainbow. I've dreamt of a color, and right now I cannot tell you, of course, because I cannot communicate what I dreamt, but I can really tell you that I had this dream. Actually, it doesn't seem to be the case. And Descartes himself, in the meditation, noted that. He said that the mind is not able to create new properties. And it is like a painter that in order to make a satyr or a siren has to put together familiar animals, like a chimera. Like, for example, this is a Bernard Prass artwork in which we see that the face is made of familiar objects. So it might be the case that our dreams are made of pieces of our external world, rather than being creation of the mind. Rather than being created in the mind, we can see here how big is the power of recombination. So our dreams are, according to the view that I am suggesting, are more like this face than a mental screen. So here we can see that face is a relative object. So we can merge together the first point and the second point, and we can say that by putting together familiar objects, we could have the power to create the world of dreams and hallucination. But this, you may argue, and we are getting close to the end, you may argue that this is not sufficient, because with Bernard Prass artwork, we have all the objects. They are all there. But that doesn't happen when we dream or when we have a hallucination. In that case, I can have a hallucination of a frog and there's no frog in front of me. But I mentioned with you at the beginning the problem of time. I just ask you to reconsider, what do we mean by perception? Do we mean to perceive events that are instantaneous, that take place at the time of neural activity, or even during everyday perception, our perception may be spread in time? And I would say that, for example, just watching at this landscape, our perception is spread in a time span that goes from the sun, that it is 8 minutes before my neural activity in the brain, the sun that I see, up to a few milliseconds for the objects that are closer to my body. But once again, here we see that what we call the present is not a snapshot, is not a film frame. That's a wrong metaphor. That's a metaphor that does not correspond to what happens in the physical world. Our present stretches to encompass everything that we find inside our present. So if we could see the sun right now, our present would be 8 minutes large. If we could see a constellation, our present might be years large. In this case, if you look at the Great Bear, we have some stars that are 100 years in the past. Is it any different looking at a star than looking at an apple? Why should it be? The apple is 50 milliseconds in the past relative to the neural activity in my brain. The star is 100 years in the past. But from a physical perspective, it's just a matter of longer light rays. But physically, it's just the same. We have an object which is impinging on my brain through a causal chain, and this causal chain may be longer or shorter. So the idea is that we have to give up the naive notion of the present as an instantaneous point on the arrow of time and consider present rather like an extended collection of objects located in space-time wherever they happen to be. After all, this is not that strange, because even if we were internalists and even if we believe that everything takes place in the brain, we would have exactly the same problem, because we would have to explain how the first spike that takes place in my visual cortex is related with the last spike that takes place in my occipital cortex 300 milliseconds later. And I don't think that saying that 300 milliseconds seems a more reasonable temporal time span than, let's say, years. Because from a physical perspective, we have just an extension. So, when we perceive the world, our present is extended by how much time it needs to. Physically, I see no reason to resist to this extended notion of the present. When we get asleep and we get isolated from the proximal present, we have past events that are still causally impinging on our brain. And that is why this theory explains why in our experience, like the cart and like in the example that I showed you before, we never find anything different from the pieces of our previous life. Because our dreams are not made of mental qualities concocted inside the brain, but our dreams, like Bernard Prass' face, are built of pieces of our previous life. And we call that kind of extended perception in time dreams or hallucinations. So basically, as strange as it seems, rather than explaining perception in terms of mental representation, like neurosciences usually do, I try to do the opposite. I try to explain hallucination in terms of extended perception of the external reality. This is what I call the space-time checkerboard. I like objects. Where we have the apple, and we have space and time. This is nature. I assume that something, in order to be real, has to be in space and time, because I'm a physicalist. We have an object. The object produces effects on the brain body. So the brain body effects are later, take place after when the object takes place. And then we have the question, where is the thing that I am? We are back to the question we started from. Where is and what is the thing that I am? Traditional neurosciences places us here in the blue square. I ask you to consider whether we might be here in the red square. We can make a quick comparison. According to classic dualism, the subject, which is not physical, perceives the object. According to many neuroscientists, it is the brain that right now does the same, but nobody knows how to explain that the brain does something that doesn't fit with the natural world. Because we are asking the brain to do something that traditionally was done by the soul. It simply doesn't work. What I suggest to you is a completely different view. Perceiving an object is just a matter of being one and the same with the object. That's why it is a mind-object identity theory. And that's why I think this fits very well with science. Because in science, in the physical world, we have no aboutness representations. We have no invisible properties that cannot be observed. We have just things that exist. And that's why I think that explaining our experience in terms of existence, we can find a way to place ourselves in the physical world. A world made of relative objects. Thank you very much.